It's a great pleasure to be here. Larry told me that we had a little bit of audio difficulty for those that are watching online. They couldn't hear the introduction that I gave, and so I just want to tee the film up again. You already heard that part of the motivation for this story was the fact that my grandmother, who at the time was 95, had gone into the hospital, the same hospital where she had sort of introduced me to the world of service. I was 5 and 6 years old. That's where we would go, and I'd watch her work with individuals late in life, hold their hand, give them gifts of dignity, and I saw how you can make someone else's life better by being present. And when she was 95, I got a call from her doctor that she was going into that same hospital and likely would not come out. And so it made all the sense in the world for me to go and hold her hand in the same fashion that I had seen her do for so many others. And I got to sit with her and hear her story. And this was one of the stories that she shared. As I shared with you all already, my grandmother did come out of that hospital despite the doctor's prognosis. She lives at home in her house, the same house that she lived in on Quince Orchard Road. And she is 104, and God willing, will celebrate 105 on June 18th of this year. The title, Finding Fellowship, is my own journey in many respects. As you know, I am not a Baltimore native son. I'm a Gaithersburg native son. I give a lot of credit to the Whartons who have adopted me in some respects, so have made me an adopted Baltimorean. And thank you for the invitation to be here, and thank you, David, for allowing me to be here. But on that street that I grew up on, which is now called Fellowship, it wasn't called Fellowship when I was growing up. When I was born, it was just a dirt road. But there was community there, and there was belonging there. And when it came time to name that road, Fellowship made sense. And so when I started this project, so much of what I had to do was research, to go back in time. And in going back in time, I felt connected. I felt that community. I felt that sense of belonging. And so this idea of finding fellowship is this concept of finding our community, our history, our sense of self, and our connection. But it's also about actively building community. And that's what we saw in Pleasant View, in Hunting Hill, in McDonald Chapel, and ultimately in Fairhaven. When those three churches united in 1968, you saw this intention and this purpose. And I know it's here in Redeemer. I see it as I walk around the halls, as I read the literature, as I look at your story, as I know that you're weaving and healing the community of Baltimore and the world. The concept of finding fellowship is about an active pursuit, recognizing that there will be no mountaintop moment, that we're constantly working to build community and to build this space that Dr. King would call the beloved community. So when I had the great joy of spending time with my grandmother, I didn't know I was making a documentary, to be candid with you. I thought that I was collecting a series of stories. I'm a lawyer. I thought maybe I could write a book, give it to the family members, put it on the shelf, and that would be good enough. But in my grandmother's wisdom, or maybe she just didn't want to see her grandson every day, she would kick me out of her hospital room. So we would have a session. I'd say, okay, Grandma, I'll be back tomorrow. And she'd be like, well, if the story resonated with you, if you were interested in what was happening in Hunting Hill, if you liked what McDonald Chapel was doing, you should go talk to them. And so she would tell me to go talk to Miss Johnson and Miss Virginia Blair and Miss Ada Howard. And so as I sat with them, I heard the same, similar, slightly different variations of the stories that my grandmother told me about the community in which she grew up. Now, how many of you have been to Gaithersburg? Oh, good show of hands. Montgomery County, if not perfect. And for those of you who haven't been to Gaithersburg, haven't been to Quince Orchard, did you still see something in the film that resonated with you, that reminded you of your church your family, the way that you grew up. Well, that's how I felt when I was hearing these stories. They resonated with me. Even if I didn't know Hunting Hill, I didn't know McDonald Chapel. And it showed me that there was a story to be told here. We could weave those threads together. And there's something that Pastor Horton said in the film that still moves me to this day. When he was faced with the decision of how to counsel these three churches that he had become the pastor of, he said that we needed more examples of African Americans and white Americans living together, worshiping together, and working together. That was true then, and it's true now. We need more examples of what's possible. I need to see it to believe it country. We are a people of faith that don't have to see it to believe it, but we need to see it to believe it country. And we get a lot of feedback about who we are. In difficult times like these, we're told who we are. When there are fractures in our family, we're told this is who we are. When our social fabric is torn, we're told this is who we are. And we need to push back and say, this is also who we are. And this is also who we can be. And we need examples to prove it and to show it. One of the pieces of feedback I got early on through this process, as I mentioned, I'm a lawyer. I'm a first-time filmmaker. Won't be an only-time filmmaker, but this is my first project. And I got a lot of guidance that there was a lot going on in this film. People would say, you've got these churches, you've got this couple that's adopted some kids, you've got this community story. Maybe you should really focus and get rid of some of these other storylines. And I thought long and hard about that. And wouldn't it be nice if we could do that in life? If we could just clear out a couple of those other competing storylines and just focus in on what's important. But I realize that they're all important. And, the ideas of that what happens outside of the church doesn't influence what's inside the church, we know is foolhardy. And we hope that what happens inside the church influences what happens outside of the church. And so that complexity is life. That complexity is community. That complexity are the ingredients of this idea of what I believe in called social fabric. And so when I was pushed, even from PBS, before they accepted the film, and I should say this film is now available on PBS. They have launched the film. It's available nationwide. I realized that we need the complexity because we need to be able to show that we've worked through things, that we can handle difficult times and still rise to the occasion. One of the things that I was, a piece of feedback that I received from individuals in early stages of the film was, of course, this can happen in a community that doesn't have a history of slavery or segregation. And I said, well, no, there is a history of slavery and segregation. It's why I had to dig into the research and go to the archives down the road and understand that this isn't the aberration, it's that those same seeds were of enslavement, of segregation. It's in that same soil that the seeds for reconciliation were planted. And again, my argument is there is no mountaintop moment. There is no moment of reconciliation. It's an active pursuit. There's a gentleman in the film, it's not entirely clear of my connection to him in the film, but his name is Tompkins Hallman, Uncle Tompkins. This is my grandmother's kid brother. He's 99 years old. And it's hard to be the younger brother to 104. You're constantly overshadowed. But he said something to me. He's 99 years old. He lives in Washington, D.C. The church is in Gaithersburg, Maryland. He drives from Washington, D.C. to Gaithersburg, Maryland twice a week. Once for church and once for choir practice on Wednesday nights. And I sat with him. I said, Uncle Tompkins, what are we doing? Why do you still make this commute? And I'm like, there are plenty of integrated congregations in D.C. There are other spaces where you can worship. And he said it was really important that they see my face in that sanctuary choir in 1968. And it's just as important now. He's the one that talked about physically moving his body. When the congregation was segregated, where all the blacks were sitting on one side and all the whites were sitting on the other, there were a few who were willing to go and sit in between, to use their bodies, their power, their privilege, and physically go and sit in between. And I believe that's what we're called to do. If we want to see this beloved community, we ask ourselves, what will we do with our bodies, with our power, with our privilege? Are we willing to go and actually sit in between? I want this to be a dialogue and a conversation, and so let me open it up. If there are any immediate questions that are on folks' hearts, please bring them to me, or I can share a few other reflections on the project. And David's got a mic, so it looks like he's going to come so folks at home can hear.
I think this is absolutely fantastic what that church has done. And I'm wondering if they have, as part of their own outreach, now that they're in the 50th year, or at the time of the end of that movie, that they're in their 50th year, do they engage with other parishes? Because there are lots of small parishes which face the challenge of how to continue. Do they use as part of their outreach, we did it, you can do it, let's help you? Is that part of their outreach?
Yeah, so the question is, given that Fairhaven is now in its 50th, and now since the film's been released, 55th year, are they engaging with other churches? Are they sharing this message? And, you know, it's really interesting. One of the pieces of sort of one of my epiphany moments in doing this project, again, this was a labor of love. I was trying to capture my grandmother's story on her deathbed, or so I thought. Sometimes I would get feedback from folks, including the pastor of Fairhaven. They say, why are you doing this? Why you have a day job? Why are we doing this? And didn't fully realize the own significance of their story. And so I think that there's an energy now to go out and tell their story, not in a we're better, but this is an option. If this is what you're trying to pursue, let us tell you our story and our journey and our scars. Pastor Horton, who was the pastor in 1968, it's very subtle in the film, but he says that the white congregants weren't particularly thrilled with him, and they asked the bishop to remove him. He never preached again. He never pastored another congregation, but he stands steadfast in his decisions in that moment. And so those scars and what they mean, and what does it really mean to be in a space of sharing power? They went through a process where they would have a black congregant that's the president, and the next year it would be a white. They were that intentional about the way in which they were going to structure and share. And so they are now engaging with other congregations of all walks of faith who are trying to figure out just how do you build community, and how do you embrace this concept of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging in a meaningful way, particularly in a faith context. Thank you for that question. And I think we had one right here. And you can say, I'll say it, I'll repeat it out. Yep. Oh, there's just for the folks that are watching on TV.
The thing which comes across is that you were revisiting your own past. And I wonder how it changed you.
Yeah, it's a great question. As I watched the film, I pace. It's sometimes hard to even see one's own face on screen because of changes. But that was one of the things that just was resonating with me in this instance of watching the film with you all, was that this really is a story about a community in change and a congregation in change, a faith community in change. It was really, when I initiated this process, to be entirely honest with you, I was looking back on a black community that I didn't know. And I was saddened by that. I was angry by that. A moment of levity. So in my conversations with my grandmother, she said, I miss my hometown. Now, she was at Asbury. That's where the hospice facility that we were at, which is in Gaithersburg. So you can imagine me. I feel like when you're in those spaces, you're constantly looking for like some sort of tell of senility, you know. I said, oh, this is it. Grandma, you know, how unfortunate that, you know, your once sharp mind is slipping because we're in your hometown. You know, we're in Gaithersburg. And my grandmother says, you know, I was born in Quince Orchard. And I said, Grandma, Quince Orchard is the name of a street. It's not the name of a town. And she said, Jason, I was born in Quince Orchard. Quince Orchard was a place. And I said, oh, this is so sad. This is so sad. And I called the family. I went home that night. It was our first fight. I've had a very close relationship with my grandmother all my years. And I left, and I couldn't shake it out of my head. And so I went online, and I Googled Quince Orchard and went back through the Washington Post archives, and I found an article from 1908. It was an article encouraging individuals who had just bought the Model T came out that year, these automobilists, to get out of D.C. and to go explore some of the surrounding towns. And it listed the small towns in order, going out from D.C., you know. And right there on the article, it said Quince Orchard. So I print the paper out, and I run into my grandmother's hospital room, and I'm like, Grandma, did you know Quince Orchard was a town? And she about, you know, took it back of her hand to me and rolled her eyes and said, oh, okay, oh, it is a town now. Yeah, I had to, like, show her the proof. And so I didn't understand how I could be a direct descendant. I grew up in the shadow of my grandmother's house. I was 2 miles away. My dad grew up in between us, a mile away from where I was growing up. He was a product of Quince Orchard, and how could I not know that it was a town? And so that I wanted to shake my fist at gentrification, all the things, all the boogeymen that were out there. And that's what started me on this journey. Anytime I could find Quince Orchard's name in print, I was energized. I went to the local high school, which was named Quince Orchard, and I told the National Honor Society, I said, I've found out that Quince Orchard is not named after a street. It's named after a community, and a community that fought for this high school to be named Quince Orchard. It's named after a one-room schoolhouse that was built right after the end of slavery. And the students came to me and they said, I thought it was named after the street too. This is great to hear. We want to help you preserve that history. We want to be a part of unearthing it. We want to be a part of preserving it. And I said, that's great. I think I'm going to write this book. Do you want to help me write a book? And they said, absolutely not. Absolutely not. That sounds terrible. But maybe we can make a movie. And that's how this idea first got planted. I thought that they would forget all about it. That was in the spring. Summer would come. And by the fall, I wouldn't hear anything from them. But in the fall, I got a call from this group of students. And they said, we've got 50 volunteers who want to research and film and make sure that the story of Quince Orchard is shared. And so for 4 years, I was their sponsor. And much of the early film work was high school students behind the camera, where I would ask a question and they might ask a follow-up or they might transcribe. And we were in this process together, kind of learning our story and seeing how this community changed. But most importantly, trying to extract the values of that community and making sure that they are embedded in this next iteration. And that's so much of the point that I want people to take away. It's what my dad's saying at the end of the film. Quince Orchard's not on the map anymore. But what mattered more to me was how it made me feel. The people, the families, the churches, the relationships, and how can we be active about preserving those things and embedding them as we think about, what is to come. I know that there's a gentleman there. Yep.
To take that one step further, what has been the impact on the children who were small when all of this first started, and now, like yourself, have grown into adulthood. What has been the impact on them, and how have they impacted where Fairhaven is going to go with this?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I've been on this journey, obviously, with my sister. Maybe not obviously, I didn't say that. So my sister is my co-producer in this project, and this is my older sister. I have two sisters. And it's interesting, part of the point about change in storytelling is about when you hear the story. This is actually a point to reverend pastors, that you may hear them say the same story a couple of times in a couple of different ways, and part of it is that we're not exactly sure when and how that story is going to resonate. And that was certainly true with me. As a young person, I didn't appreciate this story the first 20 times I heard it. I would go to our family reunion, I would go to Fairhaven, I would see the beautiful mosaic of 3 churches coming together, and would go along on my day. It wasn't for the forcing event for me with my grandmother that I sat there and somehow the same story that I'm sure I had heard over and over and over resonated in a new way. My sister, who's of the same age, was different. She, on her way to high school, would stop and have breakfast with my grandmother every day. And she knew every one of these stories by heart. By the time I came along, I couldn't be bothered to have breakfast with my grandmother every day. And so heard them in a different way, in a different venue. And I think that, that was by design. Because when, in 2014, I heard this story anew from her mouth, I was also being bombarded with the news, left, right, and center, that we are a divided people. Irreconcilably so. Economically, racially, politically. And yet, and the argument was that we hadn't been this divided since 1968. And so here was a story from 1968 that could show that we aren't wedded to our past, that we can choose a different and new future if we so choose, and how we can actually work that into existence. And so I had the luxury of getting to talk to a lot of my peer group, the other young people who I was like, does this resonate with you in the same way? Did you hear the story in the same way? And many of them didn't hear it the same way I did, or the same way that my sister did. They heard bits and pieces. But what we've been able to do collectively is realize that there's an opportunity to share that story. And this kind of goes back to your point about Fairhaven. Prior to the last 5 years, they've been a very insular congregation. I think a congregation that's forged with that kind of heat and passion, right? When a new visitor walks through the door, they run to them and say, in 1968, when Dr. King was assassinated, it's a lot for a new visitor to take in. And so they've sort of protected. They've had to preserve by protecting, and now they're trying to preserve by sharing, and sharing the story with others, both as a mechanism to hold themselves accountable, but also as a means to share what can be possible.
Good evening. I appreciate hearing the story and the voices that it emanates. And if we look at community today, post-COVID, we'll see the hope.
Yeah.
And I think that is the preference and the perception that we should gain. Because today, many congregations need to come together and bring about this kind of humanity, this compassion, a sense of love. And you see that in the struggle. And the struggle is supposed to demonstrate the elevation of love and human kindness. I love the fact that there was a family of 2 gay people with 4 black children. And today, what do we see? We see that happening all about. But is the church bringing all of that together to show and demonstrate the power of love that has existed in the past? And it's not a peculiar thing. It is a norm now. And how do we embrace that? How do we make that live so that that story becomes our story? And many churches have gone from an African-American community in Baltimore, especially down by Martin Luther King Boulevard, when all of those churches were Jewish congregations in Jonestown. And when they lost, black churches lost their churches and had to come north. But there's a beautiful congregation of Jewish people, and they keep their heritage there in Park Heights. So you have your Gaithersburg, and we have our Park Heights. But the thing about it is we integrate. There is no longer just segregation. Even though, you know, you can feel it, it doesn't have to be, because you can tell the story a different way. I can say I lived on Park Avenue at a time and it was integrated, and we moved further north, but we still became family. I didn't know the difference of just being all black, going to an all black school, because that's how Baltimore was formed. But here again, and I know that this community at Church of the Redeemed, with NAMI, working with the National Alliance of Mental Illness, this is where we come. This is where people get their support. So you have to see the story is bigger, and the mountain is to be climbed. Because in the valley, we can't always struggle unless we come up with each other. It's inclusion that brings about the change, and I think that's what your film dictates.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you. I really appreciate that feedback. Thank you. And your point is so well taken. I mean, there are two things in the film that it makes me want to lift up. The first is Dr. Horsford, Dr. Sonia Horsford, who said something, and it was quick, but I just want to highlight it for you, where she said, desegregation and integration. We use the terms interchangeably, but really desegregation is just the mixing of bodies, where integration involves true and pure social equality. And so what we're trying to accomplish is to break down these spaces that are desegregated and make them integrated, right? To achieve that equity and equality that you're talking about, and to be really intentional about it. And one of the pieces of how, you know, as people of faith, we're often looking internally. I want to tell a story about Melvin, who appears in the film. He has a brief appearance. You might remember he was jogging about 3 a.m. in the morning. I don't know if you saw that up in the left-hand corner. Let me explain why he was jogging at 3 a.m. Melvin, as you may recall, chose not to merge in 1968. Melvin's my cousin. He's my dad's age, the exact same age. They, in fact, as you saw in the film, went to the same elementary school. They lived on the same street. Their mothers were sisters. Very similar upbringing, and yet chose different paths on April 4th, 1968. And so when I was deciding, when those students inspired me to make a film, I said, well, we're going to need to have a perspective of someone who didn't merge. Fast forward to me going to Melvin and saying, Cousin Melvin, could I interview you for the film? And he said no. Oh. And I asked him again and again. And I went to my grandmother, who is my oracle, right? When I'm really vexed, I go and I sit with her. And I said, Cousin Melvin doesn't want to do my interview. I don't understand why. And she said, well, tell me why you want to interview him. And I said, well, you know, it's really important for me to have a perspective of someone like him. And she said, someone like him? The perspective of someone like him? What does that mean? What's someone like him? And I didn't realize that I had already otherized and categorized and put him in the bucket for a decision that he made in 1968, and I knew very little else about him. That's what I knew. You know, Melvin didn't merge in 68. And that was enough for me. I knew which side of the line he was on for all other things. And so, you know, Grandma, I had a praying grandmother, and she was right. And so I think she called him and said, give the boy a chance. And when I called him next and said, "Can I interview you?" he said, "If you come to my house at 3 a.m., I'll do the interview." And he hung up the phone. That's all the information I got. So I call my camera guy, and I'm like, "Hey, man, sorry to do this to you, but we're going to have to be at this house at 3 a.m. And he's like, "No problem." And so I show up into the driveway, and Melvin has his running shorts on, running shoes, an orange penny. He's stretching, and he takes off down the driveway. So, this man's 30 years my senior. I'm not going to be outdone here, so I throw on some shoes. And I chase him. My poor camera guy's driving and working the camera. And what was uncovered to me, and I didn't know, was that my cousin Melvin does a run 2 or 3 times a week, and we ran past the school that he and my father integrated. We ran past the farm where he baled hay in the summer. We ran past the piece of property where his family rented a house. We ran past his house. He was as the first one to own a piece of property in his family. We ran past Pleasant View, where his family is buried, where my family is buried. And it became clear to me that we were running his stations of the cross. These were his places of significance. And I needed to understand him. And as we ran, we talked. As we ran, we sang. As we ran, we chanted. And when we got to Pleasant View, you saw, as he lifted his hands up and said, "God, without you, where would I be?" And I recognized that I felt the same. And we knew that in this space, it was both our history and our future. And through that process, I knew Melvin in a new way. I loved Melvin in a new way. And he trusted me, right? We were able to build that trust. You can't always go on a 3 a.m. run and learn all the ins and outs of a person, but we can be in that exercise, that mountain climbing exercise of building proximity, of getting close to each other, to building relationships. And he trusted me to sit with him, to capture his story. And, more importantly than him being on the screen and a part of this film, Melvin is my friend. Melvin is an incredible bright light. Melvin, one of the exercises that has come out of the energy of the film is we are trying to preserve and restore the Pleasant View historic site, the original black church that was built 3 years after the end of slavery, the space where my great-great-grandfather put the one-room schoolhouse. Melvin's a trustee there, right? And giving in his own way to build this community. And so your point is so spot on about this work. It's the work. And so often it's the they, and we need to change that definition, broaden it, and make it a we.
This is our last
Just
question.
thinking about time. Should it?
Yeah. This is our last question.
Okay, it'll be the last one. Okay.
Just a short comment. I really appreciate your talk, and you're really highlighting how important it is for all of us to listen to each other in different ways and be ready to be cracked open out of, oh, I thought one thing and maybe there's something else. That's a great thing for us to be inspired about, so thank you for that.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate that. And maybe just the parting word, I will invite everyone to, if you have any interest in supporting that effort where we're preserving the African American schoolhouse and church. In the film, it claimed that it was a $1 million campaign. Well, due to inflation, it is now a $2 million campaign. We've, by the grace of God, raised about $1.5 million. The schoolhouse has largely been restored. We're in the process of the church. I actually put a bunch of pictures out in the Narthex area, so you can see some of those pictures from the restoration process. There's also a QR code if that's of interest. And for those that are online, you can always go to findingfellowship.film and learn about that process. And the pictures that are here are also online. The last thing I'll share is one of the stories that my grandmother shared with me, and another kind of oracle aha moment. And even before I share that, let me just say this public service announcement. Make sure that you capture the stories of the ones that you love. Do it now, in whatever form, handwritten, voice recording, camera if you've got it, great. But in whatever form or fashion you have it, do it. Because I can't tell you how many people that I meet in my travels say that, oh, I wish that I was supposed to, and I didn't, and I wish that I had, and I didn't get the chance. Many, obviously my grandmother is still with us, but many of the characters who appear in the film aren't. And it shocks me that in each instance, I would take the hour or hour and a half of footage that I had from their interview and share it with their family, and in many respects, it was the most comprehensive story of their loved one that they had. And so I just encourage, if you have the opportunity, ask the questions and make sure you document it. I would not have been so fortunate myself. I would have missed the opportunity, but for the time that God gave us. In that process, my grandmother told me about the schoolhouse. Right? You saw it on the film, the Quince Orchard Colored School, the namesake of my high school. She told me that my great-great-grandfather, Gary Green, and 3 other men, for $54, purchased land, put a schoolhouse to educate black children a few years after the end of the Civil War. My background is law. I was a government lawyer for a good number of years in the Obama administration. And so I'm really good at what if. I'm really good at paralysis by analysis. And I said, Grandma, was it really a good idea for them to build a schoolhouse on the main drag 3 years after the end of slavery and put a big sign out front that said, hey, we're educating black children here? Like, does this resonate with, this doesn't sound like a good or safe or wise idea. And my grandmother stopped me short. And she said, Jason, the black children of Quince Orchard needed a schoolhouse. There was no public education at that time, and they needed a school. Your great-great-grandfather and those other men and women looked around their community, they saw a need, and they took action. Because they were doers, and doers do. It was the most simple and profound thing I think I had ever heard. They looked around their community, they saw a need, and they took action because they were doers, and doers do. I was a pontificator. I was a hypothesizer. And from that moment on, I decided that I wanted to be on the other side of the line. I wanted to be in this community of doers who could look around their community, see need, and take action. In the way that James chapter 1, verse 22 says, to not only be a hearer of the word, but to be a doer as well. And I appreciate you, David, for inviting me here to share our message. And the message I hope that you take is that we have the opportunity and the responsibility to do. If we want to see heaven on earth, to see the beloved community come into existence, to see true integration, and not just the mixing of bodies, then it has to be our action that does. Thank you.